Midnight presses against the stained glass. The moon leaks through saints' faces and falls in pale strips across the floor. You kneel in armor that still carries the iron scent of the day's blood. A tournament ended hours ago, but your pulse has not. She stands behind the rude screen. Not your wife, not your promised future, a lord's daughter. Silk sleeves whisper when she moves. You don't look at her directly. That is the first rule. Instead, you focus on the thing in your hand. A square of linen, embroidered with a falcon stitched in red thread. It is damp where your fingers have curled around it for too long. You tell yourself it is sweat. You both know that's not the whole truth. You lift it to your lips. It is a relic and a dare. In the language of chivalry, this is not lust. This is devotion. This is ennobling desire. This is the poetry of restraint. That is what the troubadours sing in the courts of 12th century Aquitaine. That is what the code insists. But your mouth lingers on the cloth. Behind you, a priest coughs in the sacristy. You freeze. Because here's what matters. The church in medieval Europe does not fear violence half as much as it fears unregulated desire. The blade can be baptized. The bed must be policed. By the year 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council, priests are ordered to enforce confession with surgical precision. Sexual sins are cataloged like inventory: adultery, fornication, sodomy, impure thoughts. You are required to confess not just what you did, but how you did it, how often, and whether you enjoyed it. Especially whether you enjoyed it. God, apparently, is very interested in the details. And yet, at the same time, the courts of southern France are humming with something else entirely: courtly love. You hear it in the verses of troubadours under candlelight. Knights pledging absolute devotion to married noblewomen, secret glances, coded messages, fealty not just to a lord, but to a lady. Historians still argue whether this was sincere emotion or elite roleplay. Was it spiritualized adultery or theatrical flirting for bored aristocrats? Either way, it created a sanctioned fantasy space. A loophole. A system where desire could exist as long as it wore armor. You are told to adore her from a distance. To suffer. To yearn. To prove your worth through tournaments and poetry. The body must remain untouched, or at least plausibly deniable. Which is convenient, because everyone understands the choreography. In the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine during the mid-1100s, stories circulate of love courts where noblewomen supposedly judged cases of romance. Did these tribunals truly exist? Scholars debate, but the myth alone tells you something. Society was obsessed with regulating desire, even when pretending to celebrate it. The handkerchief in your hand is not just cloth. It is a contract. When a lady gives you her favor before a joust, she is publicly marking you. You fight in her name. You bleed for her reputation. You dedicate your victory to her beauty. But beneath the ritual lies something raw. You want her. And she wants to be wanted, not as property, not as a womb for alliances, but as a sovereign of longing. So you kneel in the chapel and press her linen to your mouth like a holy object. You call it chaste. You call it noble. You call it love. But your pulse betrays you. The church insists sex is for procreation within marriage. Canon law is explicit. Gratian's decretum in the 12th century codifies centuries of theological suspicion. Pleasure is tolerated only as a side effect of duty. Too much enthusiasm? That's sin. And yet the knightly class builds an entire aesthetic around controlled erotic tension. You are taught that true masculinity is not brute force, but restraint. To desire and not consume. To kneel rather than conquer. It sounds progressive. Almost modern. It is also a pressure cooker. Because repression does not erase hunger. It intensifies it. The linen smells faintly of lavender. Behind the screen, she shifts her weight. You imagine the warmth of her wrist where the cloth once rested. You imagine the pulse in her throat. Stop. You swallow. A mouse skitters across the stone. The priest's footsteps fade. You stand slowly, armor creaking like an old door. You do not look at her. That is the second rule. You place the handkerchief inside your tunic, over your heart. Symbolism is doing heavy lifting tonight. Here's the irony. The same society that preaches chastity also arranges marriages as political transactions. A noblewoman may be married at 14 to secure land. Her body is a treaty. So courtly love becomes the emotional rebellion inside a rigid structure. You cannot choose your spouse, but you can choose your devotion. You can choose to suffer beautifully. The troubadours call this fin amour, refined love. It requires secrecy. It requires longing. It requires obstacles. Without obstacles, there is no poetry. And without the church's moral surveillance, there is no thrill. You leave the chapel separately. She walks toward the keep, you toward the barracks. No words exchanged. Just that square of linen burning against your chest. Tomorrow you will tilt your lance in her honor before the entire court. Your wife will watch. Her husband will watch. The king will watch. Everyone will pretend not to understand. And you will pretend that the dampness on that embroidered falcon is just sweat. As you lie awake in the dark, you realize something unsettling. The code of chivalry does not suppress lust, it refines it. It teaches you how to desire without touching, how to hunger without feeding, how to eroticize absence itself. And you begin to wonder whether the system was designed not to prevent sin, but to make it exquisite. Outside, a bell tolls for matins. You close your eyes. The linen rests over your heart like a wound that has not yet decided whether it wants to heal. And somewhere in the castle, she is awake too, holding nothing, but thinking of everything. The architecture of restraint. You walk through the great hall at dawn. Cold smoke clings to the rafters. The rushes on the floor hide stains you prefer not to identify. Servants move like ghosts, laying trenchers, pouring watered ale. On the dais, banners ripple faintly in the draught. Every inch of this castle is designed for surveillance. Balconies overlook courtyards. Narrow staircases for single-file passage. Doors are heavy and loud. Privacy is a luxury reserved for no one, and yet, desire finds corners. Let me explain. In 12th and 13th century England and France, noble households are not intimate spaces. Lords, ladies, squires, pages, clerics, visiting knights. Everyone eats together, often sleeps in shared chambers. Beds are curtained, not sealed. You do not get alone easily, which is precisely why being alone becomes electric. A brush of fingers while passing a goblet. A coded phrase in a poem. A ribbon tied to a spear. These gestures are minor on paper. They are volcanic in context. The church's grip tightens during this era. After 1215, confession becomes annual and mandatory. Priests interrogate. Manuals instruct them how to probe for sexual irregularities. Were you tempted? With whom? In what manner? Did you climax? Medieval theology has no chill, but the aristocracy does something clever. It reframes desire as service. When you pledge yourself to a lady, you are not claiming her body. You are elevating her virtue. You become her champion, her protector, her instrument of glory. Sounds wholesome. Except the language of devotion is saturated with erotic metaphor. In romances like those of Chrétien de Troyes, knights wander forests in agony for unattainable queens. Love is depicted as a wound, an illness, a fever that can only be soothed by the beloved's acknowledgement. You read these stories by firelight. You feel seen, because the code gives you permission to obsess. It gives her permission to command attention in a world where her marriage was negotiated without her consent. This is where the power dynamic gets interesting. Officially, men dominate. Legally, women's identities are folded into their husbands. Land passes through marriage. Alliances hinge on fertility. But within the theater of courtly love, a lady becomes sovereign. You kneel before her. You ask for a token. You dedicate your victories. For a moment, the hierarchy flips. And everyone pretends this inversion is harmless because it is symbolic. Symbolism, again, doing heavy lifting. The handkerchief is not just cloth. It is intimacy outsourced to fabric. A stand-in for touch. A socially acceptable fetish object. Yes, I said it. You press it to your lips instead of her skin. You sleep with it instead of beside her. You fight with it tied to your arm. It absorbs sweat, blood, maybe tears. It becomes saturated with meaning. But here's the psychological catch. The more the system restricts physical consummation, the more it intensifies fantasy. The beloved becomes idealized beyond reality. She is no longer a person with morning breath and political anxieties. She is a symbol of perfection. You are not loving her. You are loving the idea of loving her, and that idea is intoxicating. In 1184, at the court of Marie de Champagne, patronage of romantic literature flourishes. Tales of forbidden devotion circulate among elites who are fully aware of their own marital constraints. Adultery is condemned in sermons. But in romance literature, it is glamorized when wrapped in chivalric suffering. Hypocrisy? Absolutely. But also survival. Because for many noble women, this symbolic devotion offers leverage. If multiple knights publicly adore you, your status rises. Your influence expands. You can negotiate within your marriage with a subtle edge. You become the axis of male competition. It is dangerous. It is empowering. It is precarious. A misstep could mean scandal, accusations, ecclesiastical court, public penance. You have seen it happen. A lady rumored to have crossed the invisible line. A knight exiled. A confession extracted under pressure. The same society that applauds your poetic longing will destroy you if longing becomes tangible. So you learn the choreography. Eyes linger but hands withdraw. Words drip with implication but stop short of admission. Gifts are exchanged but never explicitly named as tokens of lust. You perform restraint like theater. And in the performance, you feel alive. Because repression sharpens every sensation. A sleeve brushing your wrist feels like thunder. A shared glance across the hall feels like treason. You tell yourself you are honorable. You tell yourself you are disciplined. You tell yourself this is higher love. But when you lie awake at night, armor stacked beside your bed, you replay every near touch, and the hunger grows. Here's the unsettling truth. The architecture of chivalry is not built to extinguish desire. It is built to channel it, to harness it, to convert raw lust into social currency. Your yearning becomes proof of your refinement. Your suffering becomes status. The church watches. The court watches. Everyone plays their part. And somewhere between confession and tournament, you begin to suspect that the real sin is not touching. It is wanting too honestly. Tonight, there is a feast. She will sit beside her husband. You will kneel before her to present a falcon you hunted in her name. Your fingers will brush, just barely, and you will both pretend it was an accident. Because if it wasn't, the entire performance collapses, and you are not sure which would be worse. The trial of a glance. The rumor starts with a look. It is nothing at first. A glance held one heartbeat too long during Vespers. A night lingering near a tapestry where a lady pretends to study the weave. You think you are subtle. Castles are not. Whispers travel faster than arrows. By the late 13th century, ecclesiastical courts across England and France are handling cases that read like fevered dreams of suspicion. Adultery, clandestine marriages, accusations of seduction. The church claims jurisdiction over sexual morality, and it exercises that authority with unsettling enthusiasm. You stand in the nave, summoned. Candles burn low. A cleric unrolls parchment. The accusation is vague but heavy. Improper familiarity. Suspicion of sinful intent. Intent. Not action. That is the genius of moral control. It does not wait for the body. It criminalizes the thought. You swear nothing happened, which is technically true. You never touched her beyond what custom allowed. You never crossed into chambers at night. You never sealed lips in shadow. You only looked. Apparently, that is enough. The theology behind this is clear. Augustine, centuries earlier, argued that lust begins in the heart. The act is merely the fruit. By the medieval period, that idea has matured into doctrine. Confession manuals instruct priests to probe not just deeds but fantasies. You are asked whether you felt arousal. In a church. Under a painted crucifix, you answer carefully. Here's the tension. Courtly love thrives on visible devotion, public admiration, tokens displayed, songs sung. But the church reads these same gestures through a different lens. Not poetry, temptation. The line between symbolic and physical is invisible, and invisible lines are the most dangerous kind. In some regions, secular law overlaps. In England, under common law traditions evolving after the reign of Henry II of England, adultery is often treated as a civil matter tied to property and inheritance. A husband might sue for damages if his wife's fidelity is compromised. So your longing is not just spiritual risk, it is economic threat. If a noblewoman bears a child, lineage must be unquestioned. Bloodlines determine land, titles, power. A single scandal can destabilize alliances. You begin to understand why everyone is so tense. This is not about romance. It is about control of inheritance, which makes your stolen glances politically radioactive. There's a story whispered in the corridors about a knight who crossed the threshold. A secret meeting turned physical. A servant witnessed. Word spread. The lady denied it. The knight confessed under pressure. He was exiled. She was confined to a convent for a year of penance. Her husband retained his lands. Her body became a site of purification. You tell yourself that will not be you. Because you are disciplined. Because you respect the code. Because your desire is refined. But then there are moments when refinement cracks. You see her hands trembling slightly when she passes you a cup. You see the way her breath catches when your name is announced in the tournament lists. You are not imagining it. This is mutual. And that makes it worse. Because mutual desire threatens hierarchy. If she actively chooses you emotionally, she exercises agency outside the marriage contract. Agency is unsettling in a system built on arranged obedience. Some women learn to weaponize the ambiguity. They cultivate admirers without crossing lines. They gather influence like a cloak. If accused, they claim innocence. After all, no law forbids being admired. Yet the risk never disappears. You kneel again in confession. The priest's voice is low. Have you entertained impure thoughts about a married woman? You hesitate. Your silence is an answer. He assigns penance, prayers, fasting. He reminds you that hell is described in graphic detail for a reason. You nod, you leave. Outside, snow begins to fall in thin, silent sheets. The castle courtyard softens under white. Everything looks pure from a distance. Inside, the hunger remains. Here's the psychological trap. The more authority insists that desire is dangerous, the more charged it becomes. The forbidden acquires glamour. Risk adds flavor. A glance becomes rebellion. You are not just flirting. You are testing the boundary of divine law. That is intoxicating and terrifying, because the system is designed so that you can never be certain where you stand. Too cold, and you lose honor. Too warm, and you risk damnation. You see her across the courtyard now. Snow catching in her hair. She meets your eyes. There it is again. That pause. That awareness. No touch. No word. Just a look heavy enough to summon a tribunal. You realize something with a chill deeper than winter. The real battleground of chivalry is not the tournament field. It is the human gaze. You are losing control of yours. Tonight, there will be another feast. Music, laughter, wine. And perhaps another glance. One heartbeat too long. And you begin to wonder whether the code that taught you to kneel in devotion has quietly trained you for something far more dangerous. Because next time, you are not sure you will look away. The lady who refused to kneel you are summoned at dusk. Not to the chapel. Not to the great hall. To the solar. Her private chamber is warmer than the rest of the castle. Tapestries mute the wind. A brazier glows low. The air smells faintly of myrrh and smoke. This is already dangerous. A lady's solar is one of the few semi-private spaces in a medieval stronghold. It is where she reads letters, manages household accounts, embroiders alliances into silk. It is not where a knight lingers after sunset. You step inside anyway. The door remains slightly ajar. That is the third rule. Never close the door. She stands by the window, the last light catching in her hair. No falcon embroidery tonight. No token in her hand. You bow. She does not immediately acknowledge it. Here's what matters now. The performance is cracking. For months, you have both obeyed the choreography. Glances measured, words coded, gestures calculated. It has been exquisite. It has been survivable. But something has shifted. Her husband has secured a new alliance, a second marriage negotiation for their daughter. There are rumors of increased scrutiny from the bishop. The church courts have been active in nearby counties, prosecuting cases of clandestine vows and unlicensed unions. Surveillance is tightening, and she is tired of being symbolic. You feel it before she speaks. When she turns, her eyes are not playful. They are resolute. You fight for me, she says quietly. You bleed in my name. You wear my colors, you nod. And yet she continues. I am still traded like grain. There it is. Courtly love gave her the illusion of sovereignty. Admirers kneeling. Poems recited. Her reputation elevated by your devotion. But legally, she remains under coverture. Her identity merged with her husband's. Her property rights limited. Her body aligned with lineage. You suddenly understand that your longing, for all its drama, has been safe, contained, a ritualized thrill. For her, the stakes are sharper. She steps closer, not touching. You can hear her breath. If I am to be adored, she says, I will not be adored as a ghost. This is rebellion, not the loud kind with swords and banners, the quiet kind. The refusal to be merely an emblem. Across medieval Europe, women navigate these constraints with strategic intelligence. Some enter convents to escape marriage politics. Others cultivate networks through patronage of literature. A few become political players outright. Think of Isabella of France in the early 14th century. Married to Edward II, sidelined, underestimated. Eventually orchestrating an invasion to depose her husband. Not exactly subtle. Your lady does not command armies, but she understands leverage. Your devotion is leverage. If she chooses to escalate this bond, even emotionally, she shifts power. You become not just admirer but ally. And alliances are dangerous. You feel the weight of it now. The code was designed to refine desire, to make it ornamental, manageable. But what happens when ornament becomes intent? She asks you a question. If the line vanished, would you cross it? Your throat tightens. This is no longer about glances. This is about consequence. Under canon law, adultery is a grave sin. Under secular custom, it can ignite feuds. A husband's honor is not abstract. It is territorial. Blood has been spilled for less. You think of confession, of hell described in sermons with grotesque enthusiasm, of knights exiled, of women confined. You also think of the linen falcon, of knights replaying almost touches, of hunger sharpened by denial. Dry truth. The system trained you for this moment. It fed you romantic agony and called it virtue. Now it expects you to remain obedient. You realize obedience is easier in theory. She waits. You answer carefully. I would cross nothing that endangers you. It sounds noble. It is also evasive. She studies you. Here's the psychological shift. She does not want worship. She wants agency. A choice not dictated by father, husband, bishop, or poet. The code of chivalry promised elevation of women. In practice, it often elevated fantasy instead. You both stand suspended in that contradiction. Outside, footsteps echo faintly in the corridor. The door remains ajar. Reality presses close. She reaches for the table beside her and lifts something small. Not a handkerchief. Ring. Gold. Simple. Unadorned. Not a lover's token. A family signet. If I asked you to carry my message beyond these walls, she says, would you? Now the stakes are political. Desire has merged with strategy. This is how marginalized agency survives in rigid systems. Quiet networks, trusted intermediaries, emotional bonds leveraged into logistical action. You are no longer just a knight in love. You are a potential accomplice that your heart pounds harder than it ever did in a tournament. Because this is real. This is not poetry. This could destabilize alliances. This could rewrite futures. And you understand something chilling. The church can interrogate your thoughts. The court can police your gestures. But it cannot fully extinguish human will. Not hers, not yours. You take the ring. Not as a lover. As a risk. In that moment, the performance of courtly love fractures completely. This is no longer symbolic devotion. This is resistance wrapped in silk. Footsteps stop outside the solar. A shadow passes under the door. You slip the ring into your tunic where the falcon once burned, and for the first time, you realize that the hidden erotica of chivalry was never just about bodies. It was about power disguised as longing. The latch shifts slightly. The door begins to move, and you are suddenly unsure whether you are about to be discovered or recruited into something far more dangerous. The cost of being seen. The door does not burst open. It drifts inward slowly, like a question. A servant stands there, eyes lowered. A tray in her hands, wine, 2 cups. She knows. You can see it in the stillness of her shoulders. Servants survive by noticing everything and reacting to nothing. The solar is technically open. Nothing improper has occurred. You stand at a respectful distance. Optics are intact. For now, she sets the tray down and leaves without a word. The door remains half open. That is the 4th rule. There must always be a witness close enough to preserve reputations. You exhale. The lady's expression does not soften. This is the world you inhabit. A structure so tight that even desire must perform under observation. And here's the deeper truth. The medieval obsession with regulating sexuality is not random cruelty. It is systemic stability management. Lineage equals land. Land equals power. Power equals survival. Control the womb, and you control the map. That is why canon law hovers so aggressively over intimacy. That is why secular courts concern themselves with adultery. That is why confession probes fantasy. The system cannot afford ambiguity. You carry her signet now. A small circle of gold that could ignite scandal if misinterpreted. She steps back, regaining composure. The moment is sealed, not consummated, not even explicitly romantic. But something irreversible has happened. You have crossed from symbolic longing into shared intent. You bow again, more deeply this time. When you leave the solar, the corridor feels colder than before. Torches spit resin. Shadows stretch long against the stone. You walk past other doors, behind which other lives unfold in tightly scripted roles. Husbands negotiating. Wives calculating. Clerics memorizing sins. You realize the erotic charge of chivalry was never just about forbidden's touch. It was about being seen, truly seen, not as property. Not as pawn. Not as weapon. Seen. And that kind of recognition is destabilizing. In the decades after 1300, Europe edges toward crisis. Famine. War. Eventually plague. Social hierarchies strain. The Black Death will upend demographic structures. Labor shortages will shift power balances. Women in some regions will temporarily gain economic leverage. But in your moment, that future is invisible. You only know this. The code that once felt romantic now feels constrictive. You attend the feast that night. Music swells, lutes and fiddles. Roasted meat glistens under candlelight. Laughter rises thick with wine. She sits beside her husband, serene. You kneel when appropriate. Offer polite words. No more glances than etiquette allows. You perform perfectly, too perfectly. Because now every gesture is calculated against the weight of that ring. Across the hall, a young squire watches you. He is learning, observing how to be a knight. How to channel longing into ceremony. How to adore without touching. You see yourself in him. You want to warn him. You want to say that the code will teach him to sublimate desire into poetry. But it will not teach him what to do when desire collides with power. Instead, you raise your cup. The hall roars approval at some jest from the high table. Later, in the quiet of your chamber, you remove the ring. You turn it in your fingers. It gleams faintly in candlelight. You understand now that the hidden erotica of chivalry was never about explicit acts. It thrived in implication, in proximity, in symbolism overloaded with longing. The soaked handkerchief. The shared glance. The open door. These were pressure valves. But when pressure becomes purpose, the game changes. You lie back on the narrow bed. Straw rustles beneath you. Armor rests against the wall like a silent witness. You ask yourself a question you cannot confess aloud. If the church had not fed desire as dangerous, would it feel this powerful? If marriage were chosen freely, would longing need this elaborate disguise? If women held property in their own right, would devotion require kneeling theatrics? Silence answers, because the structure persists. And yet, across Europe, subtle acts accumulate. Women commissioning their own manuscripts, entering convents to gain literacy, noblewomen influencing diplomacy through private correspondence, emotional alliances shaping political outcomes. Desire is not erased. It adapts. You think of her again, not as idealized muse. As strategist. As woman navigating a lattice of constraints. You feel something shift inside you. Less fever, more clarity. The next morning, you ride beyond the castle walls under the pretense of inspecting boundaries. In truth, you carry a sealed message bearing her signet. The road is muddy. Hooves sink deep. Crows scatter from a field where peasants bend over winter crops. The world beyond courtly theater is harsh and indifferent. And yet this small act, carrying her will beyond surveillance, feels more intimate than any stolen glance. You understand now that chivalry's greatest illusion was separating lust from power. They were always intertwined. You crest a hill and pause. The castle rises behind you, all stone and banners and sacred authority. It looks permanent. It is not. Centuries from now, historians will debate whether courtly love empowered women or merely aestheticized their confinement. Whether knights were sincere romantics or disciplined narcissists. They will analyze manuscripts, parse poetry, argue over intent. They will never fully reconstruct the heat of a glance held too long. Or the weight of a ring hidden over your heart. You urge your horse forward, because here is the haunting part. Systems of sexual control do not vanish. They evolve. They rebrand. They cloak themselves in new language, but the tension remains. Desire seeking recognition, authority seeking containment. You disappear into the tree line, and as the castle shrinks behind you, one question rides with you like a shadow you cannot outrun. When longing stops pretending to be symbolic, who truly holds the power?